Hello everyone, and welcome back to AP Bio with AP Playground. Today, we're covering topic 7.9, phylogeny. So objectives today are to describe the types of evidence that can be used to infer an evolutionary relationship. So how did species evolve chronologically or in relation to one another? And we'll be looking at phylogenetic trees and cladograms. And our suggested skill is visual representations. 2D represent relationships within biological models, including mathematical models, diagrams, flowcharts, and systems. So let's start with an introduction to phylogeny. And phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a species or a group of species. And evidence for phylogeny and that helps determine phylogeny include fossils, morphology, which is the structure, genetic analysis, and molecular evidence. But DNA and genetics are the most accurate, especially DNA, because comparing the nucleotide sequence and genome really helps show which species are closely related and helps show that evolutionary history. And so phylogeny is represented on phylogenetic trees, which are branching diagrams that represent hypotheses about evolutionary relationships. And each group on the tree is known as a taxon. So over here we can see lots of groups, and these are all taxons. Now, branch points is where there's going to be a divergence of two evolutionary lines. So if a certain species split up, there's two evolutionary lines that come from it, that's going to be a branch point. And these are going to be all the branch points here on this phylogenetic tree. Now there's an outgroup, which is going to be the least closely related taxon to the other species, and in this case that's going to be sample B, because while all of these species A, F, C, D, and E have evolved further, sample B has not evolved as much and so is less closely related. And lastly, we have sister taxa, which are the groups closest related. So for instance, sample A and F are going to be sister taxa. They're going to be the most closely related. And so some phylogenetic trees are going to show time and specific dates. Others will just show in relation to each other. So we know that from this point, sample A and F both evolved from this branch point over here, for instance. And so phylogenetic trees represent patterns of descent. They're not focused on phenotypic similarity, how outward appearance is similar. They're more focused on showing evolutionary relationships. And the amount of change over time is shown by fossils or a molecular clock, which measures absolute time of evolutionary events based on rates of mutation, because mutation is going to introduce new genes into the DNA, which can then be selected for. And they show relative time, some of them, and not all trees contain exact evolutionary dates. It's everything in comparison to other species. And they're often used with taxonomical categories such as order, family, genus, species, to show how from one we can get to the other and how we can get more and more specific when discussing species, or broader when looking at entire genuses or families of species. So let's do a little bit of practice. Which tree best matches the info shown in the table? And so our table shows nucleotide differences. And remember, looking at nucleotide sequences is the best way to show evolutionary relationships. That's going to be the most accurate way. So obviously species that have fewer nucleotide differences between them are going to be the species that are more closely related. So if we look over here, obviously species 1 is going to have 0 differences with species 1 because it's the same species, but species 1 and species 2 have 15 nucleotide differences. Species 1 and species 3 also have 15 nucleotide differences. Species 1 and species 4 has 22, and species 1 and species 5 has 43, and so forth and so forth. And as we can see from the chart, species 5 has a lot of differences with all of the other species. So it seems to be like species 5 is going to be our outgroup. It's going to be our least closely related. Now we can see which two species are the most closely related. That's going to be species 3 and species 2 that only have 7 nucleotide differences. So in the sequence of DNA, there are only 7 nucleotide differences between them. So let's look at our trees and let's find where species 2 and species 3 are going to be the most closely related. And we can see two options here where they're going to be sister taxa, and also over here where they're sister taxa. But based on this other data, we can see that species 5 is our least closely related. It's got the most nucleotide differences, so that one's going to be our outgroup. So this is going to be the phylogenetic tree that best matches the info shown, and it's going to show sort of our order of evolution. Now, another method for showing evolutionary relationships is going to be using a cladogram, which depicts patterns of shared characteristics. Shared characteristics forming the basis of a phylogenetic tree. So cladograms are going to be focused on similarities of appearance between these species. What are shared inherited traits between them? And so it places species into groups that include an ancestral species and all of its descendants, known as a clade. And we're looking specifically at shared derived characteristics. These are traits found in the most common ancestor and all of its descendants, but not in distantly related groups. And we're also looking at shared ancestral characteristics, a trait that originated in the ancestor of the group. So for instance, in this cladogram here, we can see that at this point, this is the point where hair became a shared derived characteristic. So horses are going to have hair, wolves are going to have hair, leopards are going to have hair, and house cats are going to have hair, but tortoises are not going to have hair. They came before hair became a shared derived characteristic that evolved. Then the next step is carnivorous. Horses are not going to be carnivorous. So these are shared derived characteristics in terms of evolution, and we can see that moving forward, each of the species going forward is going to have all of the characteristics of the species before it. So for instance, a house cat is going to have hair, is going to be carnivorous, is going to have retractable claws, and will also be able to purr. It is the most recently evolved out of this group. So now we're going to practice our cladograms using a question from Khan Academy. Which cladogram best represents the evolutionary relationship between these species? And as you can see here, we're not looking at nucleotide differences. We are actually going to be looking at derived characteristics, so presences or absences of certain shared derived characteristics that can show us the evolutionary relationship between these species. So we're going to start with the most closely related species in our cladogram over here, and we can see that out of the species here, the finch and the alligator share a lot of characteristics, save for feathers, which only finches have. But these 5 characteristics here and these 5 over here are almost shared entirely except for the feathers. So that would suggest that alligators and finches are going to be our most closely related species. And then going from there, we can see that a chimpanzee is actually going to have 3 out of the 5 characteristics shared. So it's going to have 4 of these characteristics, but 3 of them are going to be shared with alligators and finches. So it's also pretty closely related. Then if we keep going, we'll see that frogs only have 2 of these characteristics, whereas tuna only has 1. So tuna is going to be our and then tuna is going to be even less related. And lastly, the lancelet doesn't have any of the shared derived characteristics. So as we can see, our lancelet is going to be our most distant. Its evolution is going to not have occurred and given the lancelet these shared derived characteristics. But we do know that the alligator and the finch are going to be the most closely related. So as you can see here, this cladogram will represent that relationship of the finch and the alligator being closely related, with the finch having evolved feathers. Then the chimpanzee is the next closest related, and the chimpanzee also has mammary glands as a characteristic. Then the frog, which is going to share these 2 characteristics. Then the tuna, which only shares 1 characteristic. And lastly, the lancelet, the least evolutionary related, which does not share any of the characteristics. So there you have it. We looked at phylogeny. We showed the evolutionary relationships, both based on genetic data and also on shared derived characteristics. And we'll see you in 7.10 to talk about speciation.